Hey there, come closer to the fire, because tonight we are standing on the last safe ground of Spain. While three small wooden ships breathe in the dark water, and roughly 90 men wonder if morning will carry them toward glory, or toward a place no one comes back from. The harbor smells of tar, salt, fish, mud, and fear. The sun has already gone down over Palos de la Frontera, and the Rio Tinto moves quietly beneath the piers, black as spilled ink. Torches burn along the waterfront. Their light trembles over ropes, barrels, wet planks, and faces that keep turning toward the ships, then away again, as if looking too long might make the choice real. Tomorrow, before the day has properly opened its eyes, those men will board the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta. They will leave wives, mothers, children, debts, taverns, church bells, warm bread, and the solid comfort of streets they know by memory. They will sail west into the ocean sea, where maps grow uncertain and every rumor has room to breathe. No rescue waits beyond the horizon. No friendly harbor is promised. Only water, wind, work, prayer, hunger, and the hope that the world is not larger than their courage. If stories like this keep you company at night, please like this video and subscribe. It helps this small candle stay lit for the next voyage. Now settle in a little. Let the room dim around you. Let the fire speak softly. We will not rush the ocean. In 1492, nothing moved quickly across the Atlantic. Not fear, not hope, not ships. So, let us begin with the night before. Palos is not asleep. Not really. The streets behind the harbor may be dark, the shutters closed, the church stones cooling after the heat of the day. But down by the water, men are still moving in little knots. A rope is checked again, though it has already been checked twice. A barrel is shifted because someone says it should sit lower in the hold. A lantern swings from a post and throws a thin yellow circle over a coil of hemp. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then decides even that is too much effort for such a heavy night. The ships lie moored in the river mouth, small against the dark. That is the first truth to hold. They were small. Not small in the poetic way people say a ship is small beneath the stars. Small in the practical, uncomfortable, almost ridiculous way. If you were standing here with me and saw them waiting at anchor, you might have expected fishing boats, coastal traders, vessels meant for familiar waters and quick returns. You would not immediately think, yes, those are the little wooden rooms that will carry men across an unknown ocean and into another world. The Santa Maria is the largest, and even she is no giant. She is a merchant vessel, a nau, broad, sturdy, high-sided compared with the others, but still modest enough that a modern person might stare for a moment and laugh nervously. Her full length is often estimated at around 19 meters, though we should say this gently because the exact measurements are debated. The original plans are gone, if they ever existed in the way we imagine ship plans now. Historians work from later descriptions, similar vessels, shipbuilding practice, and careful reconstruction. The details shift. The main feeling does not. She is shockingly small for what she is about to attempt. Her hull rises and falls a little at the mooring. Wood creaks against rope. The sound is not loud, but it is constant, like an old creature clearing its throat in sleep. The seams have been packed with oakum and tar to keep the sea out. That smell hangs everywhere, sticky, sharp, and dark. Fresh tar has a way of promising safety while reminding you exactly what it is trying to prevent. Water once in. Always. The whole art of a ship is the long argument between wood and water. The Santa Maria has raised structures at bow and stern, small castles of timber that make her look taller than she is. The stern holds the few better spaces, the places where officers may sleep or keep instruments, papers, charts, and private worries. Below, in the hold, there are casks of water, barrels of wine, food, spare canvas, rope, tools, trade goods, and all the heavy, ordinary things that must become survival once Spain is gone. The hold is not a pleasant place. It is dim, close, and filled with the smell of wood, pitch, dampness, and stored food already beginning its slow journey toward staleness. The Nina and the Pinta are smaller, caravels, faster, lighter, more open, better suited for exploration and coastal work, but much less comforting if you are thinking about storms, sleep, or privacy. Their decks are low and exposed. There is little enclosed space for ordinary sailors. Most men will live on open planking, under weather, under sky, under orders. They will eat there, work there, doze there, mutter there, and wake there when the ship lurches or someone calls for hands. Imagine being told that your world for the next weeks, maybe months, is a strip of deck where a strong person could throw a stone from bow to stern. Imagine trying to find a private corner and realizing there is no such thing. Your blanket is your room. Your coil of rope is your wall. Your silence is only silence until the man beside you begins to snore. Honestly, that is one of the parts that makes this voyage feel so human to me. History often paints it with flags and grand lines across maps, but the lived truth was damp wool, crowded bodies, hard planks, and men trying not to step on one another in the dark. A discovery can begin with someone looking heroic in a painting. An actual crossing begins with someone asking where he is supposed to sleep. On the last night, some men probably walked the docks, pretending to be busy. It is an old trick. When fear comes close, hands look for work. A knot can be retied. A belt can be adjusted. A knife can be sharpened. A man can check his bundle again, then again, although it holds the same poor things as before. A spare shirt. A little food from home. A shawm. A rosary. Maybe a small object pressed into his palm by someone who did not want to cry. The families wait in the uneven light. We do not know every goodbye. Most ordinary sailors leave only faint marks in the record. But we know enough about leaving to imagine the shape of it. A wife trying to stand steady. A mother watching her grown son with the same eyes she had when he was small. A child more excited by the torches than frightened by the departure. Because children are mercifully bad at understanding finality until it has already happened. Some of the men are experienced sailors. They know storms. They know hunger. They know the hard humor of the sea. They have run along coasts, fished, traded, sailed to islands, perhaps down toward Africa. They can read the color of weather at dawn. They can hear when a rope is wrong by the way it complains. They are not fools, and that makes their fear sharper. Ignorant courage is one thing. Skilled men know exactly how many ways wood can fail. The West is the problem. South has routes. East has stories. North has cold and trade and known dangers. West is different. West is an emptiness filled by books, guesses, old authorities, sailor talk, holy hope, and tavern nonsense. Men did not all believe the world was flat. That is too simple, and history is rarely kind to simple things. Educated navigators knew the earth was round. But knowing the earth is round does not tell you how wide the ocean is. It does not tell you whether winds will bring you back. It does not tell you whether food will last, or whether the sea will hold you in a calm until your courage dries up with the water casks. A man can believe in a round world and still fear that he is sailing into death. Columbus believes. That much seems clear. He believes with a force that must have been impressive and exhausting in equal measure. He is Genuisa, in Castilian service, backed at last by the monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella after years of refusal, waiting, persuasion, and stubborn arithmetic. He thinks he can reach Asia by sailing west. He thinks the distance is manageable. He thinks the ocean will open a road. He does not know, because no European in his world has crossed that ocean and returned with the answer. No one aboard knows. That is the darkness under this story. Not ignorance exactly, but uncertainty. The kind that sits in the stomach. The kind that makes jokes sound a little too loud. The kind that makes men look toward the ships and then toward the town and then toward the ships again. The torches continue to burn. Smoke leans with the river air. The masts sway gently. Black lines against a darker sky. Rigging taps and whispers. Water slaps the hulls. Patient and ordinary, as if tomorrow is nothing special. The ships do not care that history is waiting. Ships are practical things. They need wind, hands, repairs, and luck. The ocean is the same. It does not become gentler because a king and queen have signed papers. It does not part because a man believes. That is why the smallness of the vessels matters so much. Until you feel how little wood stood between these men and the Atlantic, you cannot feel the voyage properly. We are used to thinking of oceans through maps, clean blue shapes crossed by lines. But a sailor in 1492 did not live on a map. He lived inside sound, creaking timber, slapping water, canvas breathing above him, men coughing in sleep, the dull thud of barrels shifting in the hold, the little glass of sand being turned again and again when the real crossing begins. On this last night, though there is still land, that is what makes it tender. A man can step away from the ship and put his foot on earth. He can smell cooking smoke from houses. He can hear voices from the town. He can walk to church. He can still change his mind in his imagination, even if duty, vagus, pride, fear of shame, or royal pressure holds him in place. Somewhere, a sailor may be telling another that the voyage will be short. Asia is closer than people think. There will be islands, gold, spices, honors, perhaps enough money to return home with a better coat and a louder voice in the tavern. Somewhere else, another man is saying nothing because he has already decided that too much talking invites bad luck. A boy tries to look older than he is. A convict, if he is there among them, may look at the ships and decide that the unknown sea is still better than a known prison. That is a grim kind of hope, but hope comes in many coats. The night deepens. The harbor becomes a place of small lights. The ships drift slightly against their moorings, then settle. A gull cries once from the dark, irritated by human restlessness. The river carries the smell of mud out toward the wider water. If you stand at the edge of the pier and look west, there is nothing to see. That is the hardest sight in the world sometimes. Nothing. No monster. No storm. No sign. Just the black meeting of water and sky. The mind fills it because the eye cannot. Tomorrow, the men will follow that darkness. They will begin with prayers, with voices inside stone walls, with Latin words many know by sound more than meaning. They will walk down through streets where families wait. They will step onto decks that feel too small once the river starts moving. They will pass the last turns of the Rio Tinto, then the last low lands, then the last familiar coast. For a while, they will still have the Canary Islands ahead, a final human foothold before the true unknown. But tonight, they are still in Palos, with the 3 ships breathing softly beside the pier. The fire in our room settles. The candle leans. Stay with that image a moment. Not Columbus on a monument. Not a painted banner. Not a triumphant map. 3 little ships. A dark river. Men trying to be brave in the smell of tar. That is where the crossing begins. To understand the fear of the men, we need to step aboard the ships, slowly, as if the planks might remember the weight of every foot that crossed them. The Santa Maria is called the flagship, and that word can mislead us. Flagship sounds grand. It suggests polished decks, broad cabins, a proud vessel with room for command. But the Santa Maria is a working ship, a small merchant now pressed into an enormous gamble. She is solid compared with the caravels. Yes, but solid is not the same as comfortable. Her timbers are thick, her belly round, her castles raised at bow and stern, and every part of her seems to be doing more than one job because there is no space for anything to do, only one. If you were standing on her deck, you would feel the ship move even at anchor. Not dramatically, just enough to remind the knees that the earth is gone. A soft lift, a small drop, a twist through the frame. The rail under your hand would be rough in places, polished in others by work and weather. Tar would cling to seams and rope, The air would smell of pitch, damp wood, old salt, and the heavy promise of stored food below. The mainmast rises over you, with its square sail ready to take the wind. The foremast carries its own canvas. A smaller mizzen at the stern helps balance and steer. The rigging is a web of hemp and shadow. In the day, it is work. In the night, it becomes lines of black against the stars, creaking softly as the ship shifts. There is a stern castle where Columbus and officers may have had some degree of privacy, though privacy on a ship this size is a generous word. There are small protected spaces, places for papers, instruments, perhaps a chest, perhaps a little sleep away from the worst of the spray. For ordinary sailors, the ship is mostly deck, weather, and whatever corner can be claimed before another body claims it first. The Nina and the Pinta feel even more exposed. They are caravels, lighter and quicker, with lower profiles and more open working space. They are better suited to exploration than the Santa Maria, more nimble, easier to handle, able to work closer to unknown coasts when the time comes. But during a long crossing, that openness becomes a kind of discipline. The sailors live under sky. Rain finds them. Spray finds them. Heat finds them. Every voice finds them. A modern person might call them tiny. A sailor might call them workable. The ocean would call them wood. Their exact dimensions are debated, as careful historians remind us. The Santa Maria may have been around 19 meters in hull length. The Pinta, perhaps around 17. The Nina, perhaps around 15. The numbers change from reconstruction to reconstruction. But the important thing is not the last decimal. The important thing is that these ships were small enough that men could never fully escape one another. Small enough that a cough at night became part of the weather. Small enough that an argument near the mast could travel from bow to stern before the speaker was finished. Now place roughly 90 men among them. 90 men, divided across 3 vessels, each carrying his own hunger, pride, fear, memory, and smell. That last detail is not elegant, but it matters. History smells. It sweats. It coughs. It gets wet and cannot dry. These men did not sail as clean figures in a mural. They sailed in wool, linen, leather, salt, smoke, and fatigue. They slept near rope, barrels, tools, and each other. A ship is intimate long before anyone wishes it to be. Most of the crew came from the seafaring towns of the region, Palos, Moguer, Huelva, and nearby places where the sea was not romance, but labor. Boys grew up watching men mend nets, load cargo, curse weather, and judge wind by habit. These were not people who thought water was decorative. They knew it could feed a family and take one. They knew a good helmsman mattered. They knew the difference between a sail that breathed properly and one that fought the wind. They knew that a loose seam could become a grave. That knowledge did not remove fear. It made fear intelligent. Columbus needed such men. He had royal backing. He had conviction. He had arguments from books, calculations, and long persuasion. But a conviction cannot haul a line. A royal order cannot caulk a seam in a rising sea. An idea cannot climb rigging in a squall. For that, he needed the sailors of the coast, and more than anyone, he needed the Pinzon brothers. Martin Alonso Pinzon was the kind of local man whose name carried weight because people had seen him work. He was a respected mariner, ship owner, navigator, and man of means. He knew Atlantic ventures. He knew the ports. He knew how sailors think when wind turns ugly and hope becomes thin. He commanded the Pinta, and his support made the enterprise feel possible to men who might not have trusted a foreign dreamer on his own. Vicente Yanez Pinzon, younger but capable, commanded the Nina. Together, the brothers brought not only ships and experience, but credibility. That is a word that can sound dry until you imagine the dock at night. A sailor may not understand every claim Columbus makes about Asia, distance, and royal privilege. But if Martin Alonso says the voyage may work, if he puts his own name and vessel into the dark, that matters. This is how impossible things often begin. Not with everyone believing the visionary, with enough people trusting the person standing beside him. The ships also carried specialists, because a voyage like this could not survive on courage alone. There was a carpenter, a man whose ears and hands knew wood better than most men know faces. He could shape a spar, repair a split, strengthen a loose piece, and listen to the ship as if she were speaking through her joints. At sea, the carpenter was not a tradesman in the background. He was one of the reasons the ship remained a ship. There was a caulker, whose work was humble and sacred in the practical sense. He inspected seams between planks, pressing fiber and tar into the places where water looked for permission. Think of that task. Again and again, he studies the line where two boards meet. He feels dampness, swelling, weakness. He carries the knowledge that the ocean does not need a doorway. It only needs patience. A ship that stops being watertight does not become symbolic. It becomes a coffin. There were pilots, the men of direction and estimate. They worked with compass, ski, memory, and dead reckoning. They watched the ship move through water and turned that motion into distance in the mind. They could use instruments such as the quadrant or astrolabe, though on a rolling deck, such tools were awkward and often uncertain. Their most important instrument may have been experience, the feel of speed, the set of wind, the angle of swell, the uneasy art of saying, "We have gone this far," though no land has confirmed it. There was also Luis de Torres, an interpreter from Moguer, a converso, a man of Jewish heritage who had converted to Christianity. He knew languages that Columbus believed might be useful when they reached the lands of Asia. Hebrew, some Aramaic, Arabic, Castilian. Columbus expected courts, Mercian, perhaps envoys of the Great Khan, perhaps people with whom words from the Eastern Mediterranean might open doors. This is one of those details that feels almost tender now, because we know what they did not. Luis de Torres carried languages for a world Columbus expected to find, not the world that waited. When he would later go inland on Cuba, searching for palaces and high civilization as Columbus imagined them. He would instead encounter villages and customs unknown to Europe, including people using dried leaves in a way that would become the first recorded European encounter with tobacco. An interpreter prepared for Asia stepped into the Caribbean with the wrong keys in his hand. The voyage carried the machinery of royal interest, too. There was an inspector or controller, someone responsible for watching the crown share, especially if gold or valuables appeared. There were notaries, men who could record claims and make documents legal. This matters. The voyage was not only adventure, it was business. It was monarchy. It was future empire in seed form, packed aboard before any new shore had been reached. That is a darker detail, soft but sharp. On those little ships, along with biscuit and rope, they carried paperwork for possession. The ocean had not yet opened, but the habit of claiming was already aboard. Then there were the ordinary sailors, the men whose names are mostly lost or half known. They hauled lines, trimmed sails, scraped, pumped, climbed, watched, bailed, cursed, prayed, sung, and tried to sleep in damp clothing. They did not decide the course. They carried it in their bodies. Their hands would blister, then harden. Their backs would ache. Their patience would thin. Their courage would not look like a statue. It would look like getting up for another watch when the deck is cold and your stomach is sour. There were ship boys, some very young, given hard little tasks that never ended. One might turn the half-hour glass day and night, marking time by sand, while older men depended on him to keep the watches honest. Imagine that boy, barefoot or nearly so, standing near the mast, watching grains fall from one bulb to another. He is tired. His eyes burn. The sea breathes in the dark around him. When the last sand slips through, he turns the glass, calls the count, and another small piece of the ocean has passed. There may have been convicts, too, men whose sentences were commuted if they joined the voyage. We do not know every detail, and the record is not always as full as a storyteller would like. But the presence of such men tells us recruitment was not easy. For some, the choice may have been a cell or the sea, a known misery or an unknown one. It is a hard bargain, but human beings have accepted worse for the chance of air. Picture one of them at the rail before departure. He may not be thinking of Asia, or gold, or royal glory. He may be thinking only that the harbor is open and prison walls are not. Hope can be noble, but sometimes it is simply the first breath outside a locked door. Above this mixed human cargo stood Columbus, foreign-born, intense, certain, dependent on men who did not entirely belong to him. He spoke Castilian with an accent. He had the backing of monarchs, but not necessarily the hearts of sailors. He could command, but command at sea is never pure. A captain needs obedience, yes, but also trust, shill, luck, and the grudging cooperation of men who know when fear is reasonable. Columbus must have understood, at least partly, how fragile his authority was. If the voyage stretched too long, if no land appeared, if provisions spoiled, if water turned, if the men decided His calculations were fantasy. Royal approval would not hold a rope in their hands. He needed the Pinzon brothers. He needed the pilots. He needed the boys to keep turning the glass. He needed every ordinary sailor to continue believing, or at least continue working, one watch at a time. It is tempting to imagine him as either hero or villain from the beginning, but the deck of 1492 is more uncomfortable than that. He is ambitious, stubborn, brave, devout, mistaken, brilliant in some ways, blind in others. He is about to cross an ocean through a mixture of courage, error, faith, and miscalculation. He thinks he is sailing to Asia. He is not. He thinks the distance is shorter than it is. It is not. He thinks the world will answer his theory. It will answer, but in a language he does not understand. None of the men understand it yet. For now, they are only a fleet. 3 small ships. Roughly 90 souls. Local sailors and royal agents. Boys and veterans. Specialists and convicts. A foreign admiral and the Pinzon brothers who make him believable. Food in casks. Wine in barrels. Rope in coils. Faith in prayers. Fear in the throat. If you were standing with them, you would not hear history call its own name. You would hear planks creak. You would hear someone laugh too loudly at a poor joke. You would hear a man spit into the water. You would hear the small slap of the river against the hull and the restless breath of animals or men below the level of sight. You would smell tar, sweat, and mud. You would see torchlight on faces that are trying to look ready. The ships are not ready in the way modern machines are ready. They are ready in the way old wooden things become ready. Patched, loaded, blessed, argued over, and trusted because there is no better option. The men are the same. Soon, the night will thin. The church will receive them for final prayers. Feet will move through the streets of Palos toward the waterfront. Lines will be cast off. The current will take the hulls downriver. Families will become shapes on the shore, then dots, then memory. But before that morning comes, hold them here a little longer. The 3 vessels at anchor, the black water moving under them, Columbus with his enormous idea, the Pinzons with their practical weight, the sailors with their private bargains, the boys with sleepy eyes, the convicts with uncertain hope, all of them crowded onto wood that seems far too small for the size of the world. And still, when dawn comes, they will step aboard. Before dawn, the Church of San Jorge held the men for a little while longer. Stone kept the night cool inside. Candle flames trembled along the walls. The air smelled of wax, damp cloth, old wood, and the faint salt that clung to sailors even when they stood on land. Some of the men knelt because they were devout. Some knelt because everyone else did. Some may have bowed their heads and thought less about heaven than about the faces waiting outside. The wives and mothers and children who would stand by the water until the ships became too small to follow with the eyes. The priest spoke in Latin. The words rose and fell in the dimness. Many of the men knew the sound better than the meaning, but sound can be enough when fear is near. A familiar prayer can be like a hand on the shoulder. It does not solve anything. It does not calm the sea. It simply reminds a frightened body that it has heard these words before and survived the hearing. Columbus was there in that atmosphere of wax and stone, carrying his enormous certainty. The Pinzon brothers were there too, men of the coast, men the sailors understood. Around them were pilots, seamen, boys, specialists, perhaps convicts, all gathered inside a small parish church before stepping into a much larger darkness. Outside, Palos was beginning to stir. The streets were narrow and still shadowed. Footsteps sounded sharper than usual because everyone was listening. A man carrying his bundle might hear the scrape of his own sandals against stone and think, absurdly, of how ordinary that sound was. The last walk through a familiar street often feels ordinary in the moment. That is one of memory's small cruelties. Only later does the mind understand that a door, a wall, a corner, a bakery smell, a church bell were saying farewell. Families waited along the way and near the quay. We cannot know every face, but we can imagine the shapes of leaving. A wife holding her arms close because if she reached again, she might not let go. A mother pressing food or cloth into a son's hand. A child asking when the ship would come back and being given an answer too quick to be trusted. Some men made jokes. Some adjusted belts and knives. Some stared at the ground. A few may have wanted to run, not because they were cowards, but because the body sometimes understands danger faster than pride does. The river lay black below the piers. The three ships were ready in the way ships become ready. Never perfectly, always with something still damp, something still creaking, something still needing a final hand. The Santa Maria sat heavier in the water, the flagship, broad and watchful. The Nina and the Pinta moved more lightly, their lines leaner, their decks lower, their future perhaps faster and wetter. Barrels had been stowed, ropes coiled, sails prepared. The tide and current waited with the patience of things that do not care about human history. Men climbed aboard. A foot left stone and found plank. That small transfer mattered. Land to ship. Certainty to motion. The deck shifted under each body, softly at first, just a slow lift and settle, but enough to tell the knees that the world had changed. A man might glance back at the shore and see faces lit by early gray. He might raise a hand and then drop it quickly, because too much farewell can break a person open. Lines were cast off. Ropes slapped wetly. Men pushed with poles. The ships began to move down the Rio Tinto, carried by tide and current, past mudflats and marshes, past the low-breathing land around Palos. The sound of the town thinned behind them. Voices became less distinct. The church, the roofs, the watchers on shore, all began to shrink. For a while, the leaving was still gentle. Rivers are kinder than open seas in the way they narrow the view. They give you banks, reeds, curves, places for the eye to rest. The men could pretend that this was only another departure, another coastal run, another day of work. The hulls creaked. The water moved beside them. Birds lifted from the marsh. Morning opened slowly over Andalusia. But every bend carried them farther. By midday, the river had given them to coastal waters. By evening, Spain was already becoming a dark line behind them. That line must have had a strange power. It was still land, still home, still the edge of a known world where churches stood, bread baked, debts waited, and people remembered your name. Ahead lay the first leg of the journey, the run south toward the Canary Islands. And that part, at least, was not complete madness. The Canaries were familiar enough to Iberian sailors. Ships bound for Atlantic ventures and West African routes used them as a stepping stone, a place for water, repairs, waiting, and wind. Columbus had planned to go there before crossing west. It was sensible. You did not simply leave Spain and throw yourself straight across the unknown. You moved south first. You staged the voyage. You gave men one last taste of land before taking it away. Still, even the familiar leg began with trouble. The Pinta developed rudder problems somewhere along the early route. The surviving accounts suggest the rudder became loose or damaged, and Columbus suspected sabotage by people unhappy about the voyage. We cannot be certain. Old accusations have a way of arriving with salt on them, blurred by memory, pride, and later legal quarrels. But the practical danger was clear. A ship that cannot steer properly has no business crossing an ocean. A rudder is not an ornament. It is the hand by which the vessel feels its path through water. Imagine the moment the trouble was noticed. The helmsman feels something wrong through the tiller. Not a dramatic break at first. Perhaps a looseness, a delay, a refusal in the stern. He calls another man. They test it. The ship answers poorly. Word moves. Men look aft. A small fault becomes large because the sea is large. The Pinta limps on, and with every mile, the plan bends toward repair. They reached the Canary Islands. First, Gran Canaria, then La Gomera, the western island that would become their final door. There, the voyage paused for nearly a month. For Columbus, the delay must have been irritating. For many sailors, it may have felt like mercy. The Canaries were not home, but they were land. That was enough. There were wells, houses, people, churches, taverns, voices not trapped on deck. A man could walk until his legs remembered that the world did not always rise and fall under him. He could smell earth warmed by sun, not just tar and bilge. He could hear animals from behind walls. He could look at women in doorways and children in dust and think, this is still the world I know. Meanwhile, work continued. The Pinta had to be repaired. Men bent over the damaged steering gear, lifting, bracing, scraping, fitting, strengthening. Wood struck wood. Tools rang. Tar softened in heat. The carpenter and others made the ship seaworthy again, because there would be no helpful island once the westward crossing began. Every weakness had to be faced now, in harbor, while land could still catch them. The Nina also changed. She had carried laden sails, triangular sails useful for coastal work and for tacking. But at La Gomera, she was re-rigged with square sails, better suited for running before steady winds across long distance. That change was more than technical. It was a decision made in canvas. The ship was being prepared not for wandering near known coasts, but for holding a westward wind for days and weeks. Men watched the work with different thoughts. Some saw competence and felt reassured. Some saw preparation and felt trapped. A ship being made ready can feel like a door being locked. Provisions came aboard. Casks of fresh water, heavy and dark, were rolled and hoisted. Barrels of wine, hard biscuit, salted meat, dried fish, legumes, oil, vinegar, cheese, firewood, tools, spare rope, spare canvas. Every item had the dull importance of survival. On land, a cask is only a cask. At sea, it becomes time. A barrel of water is not water only. It is another week of possible life. The men may have eaten better in those last island days than they would for a long while. Perhaps there was fresh food, fruit, local fish, bread not yet hardened into a weapon against the teeth. Perhaps there was wine in cups instead of rationed portions. Perhaps laughter came easier for a little while. Fear often loosens when the sun is warm and land is underfoot. The unknown becomes abstract again. The West becomes a word, not yet a place where the horizon has swallowed everything behind you. Some must have been tempted to stay. It is hard not to imagine it. A small injury could be exaggerated. A sickness could be hoped for. A man might look at the harbor of La Gomera and think, surely one missing sailor would not stop the fleet. But staying would bring shame, punishment, lost wage, perhaps worse. And there were the Pinzon brothers, local authority in human form. There was Columbus, burning with his certainty. There were companions watching one another for weakness. So the men stayed with the ships. On September 6th, the fleet departed La Gomera. The wind was right. The repairs were done. The provisions were aboard. The island darkened behind them, volcanic and familiar, the last visible edge of the known world. The sails filled. The hulls leaned gently into the west. Water opened ahead. At first, the men could still turn and see land. That is its own kind of comfort. Even when you are leaving, if you can still see the shore, part of you believes return is simple. The island sits there behind the stern, a shape in haze, a promise that the world has edges. Then it became smaller. The dark lines softened. The heights lowered. La Gomera and El Hierro became shadows, then marks, then a memory the eye kept trying to restore. Men looked back more than they needed to. Some pretended to be checking rigging. Some stood openly and watched. Perhaps a few wept. There is no shame in that. To see the last land disappear while sailing into a blank ocean is not a small thing. It is the kind of moment the body records, even if the mouth says nothing. At last, there was only water. No coast behind. No island ahead. No smoke. No tower. No hill. No chapel bell. No brown line of earth under the sky. Just the Atlantic spreading in every direction, blue by day, black by night, breathing beneath 3 small ships. The psychological crossing had happened before the physical one. The men were no longer sailing from Spain to the Canaries. They were sailing west from the last island into the ocean sea. Whatever courage had been easy in harbor now had to become daily labor. Whatever faith sounded strong in church now had to survive empty horizons. Whatever Columbus believed now had to meet wind, distance, food, water, and the private arithmetic of frightened men. For a while, no one knew how long the emptiness would last. The ships moved on. The glass would turn. The watches would begin. The decks would be scrubbed. The sails trimmed. The ropes coiled. The prayers muttered. The meals shared. The distances guessed. Land had disappeared, and with it, the old shape of time. Now, time would be measured in sand, in bells, in sore hands, in the same horizon returning again and again, as if the whole world had become a circle of water. Once the last island vanished, the voyage became a pattern. That may sound strange. We imagine the unknown as constant drama, but human beings cannot live in drama forever. Even fear needs a schedule. After La Gomera faded behind them, the men on the Santa Maria, the Nina, and the Pinta began to build their days out of small repeated acts. Work, watch, food, prayer, repair, sleep, if sleep would come. The ocean remained enormous, but the day had to be divided into pieces small enough for the body to carry. Time lived in glass, near the main mast, where it could be guarded from spray as much as possible, hung the half-hour glass. Sand slipped from one bulb to another, grain by grain, soft and tireless. A ship boy, one of the youngest aboard, had the duty of turning it. Every half hour, day and night, his sleepy eyes had to watch for the final trickle. When the last grains fell, he turned the glass, called the mark, and another small portion of the Atlantic was counted. It is easy to pass over that boy. History likes admirals and captains. But imagine him, bottom feet on damp planks, hair stiff with salt, hands perhaps too small for the labor around him, but old enough now to belong to the ship. He waits in darkness while grown men doze in bundles around him. The glass empties. He flips it. His voice rises. The watch continues. The watches shaped everything. Men worked in turns, usually around 4 hours at a time, though the rhythm of a ship was never perfectly gentle. One group stood duty while another tried to rest, mend clothing, eat, or simply sit with the blank tiredness that comes after hauling rope in salt air. Then the glass turned again, and again, and the ship exchanged one set of weary bodies for another. Before dawn, the deck stirred. The sky was still dark, but not completely. A thin gray would begin low in the east, almost hidden at first, like breath on metal. Men lifted themselves from cloaks and corners. Someone coughed. Someone cursed softly. Someone crossed himself without opening his eyes. The off-going watch handed over what had been felt through the night. The course, the wind, the behavior of the helm, any change in swell, any small complaint from rigging or hull. Sailors notice what others miss. A rope rubbing differently, a block that knocks rather than clicks, a sail edge that flutters with a wrong voice. On land, such things are nothing. At sea, they can become warnings. Then came cleaning. It was not romantic, but it was necessary. A small ship crowded with men becomes filthy quickly. Water runs where it wants. Food spills. Bodies sweat. Waste must be carried away. Fish scales, crumbs, tar, mud from shoes, bits of rope fiber, all gather in corners unless hands remove them. Buckets were lowered over the side and hauled up full of cold Atlantic water. Men threw it across the planks. Bare feet stepped through shining streams. Brushes, rags, and rough bundles scraped the deck. The smell rose with the water. Salt, tar, old fish, damp wool, stale wine, smoke from the cooking fire, and the sour breath of bilge below. The bilge was the hidden low place where every leak and foul drip eventually gathered. Men pumped it out, but it never stopped being there. A ship at sea has a stomach, and the stomach is rarely pleasant. After cleaning, there were lines to check. Hemp rope roughened the palms. It held salt, dampness, tar, and the memory of strain. Men coiled it carefully, because a tangled rope can become danger when the wind changes. Blocks were inspected. Sails were trimmed. The square canvas had to be held properly to the trade wind, not too loose, not too tight. A sail is a kind of listening cloth. It tells the sailor when the wind is being used well, when the breeze was steady. The ships moved with a rhythm, almost gentle. The hull lifted, paused, settled, lifted, paused, settled. The sails bellied and breathed above them. The wake whispered past the stern. It might have been soothing if the men had not known how far they were from help. At the helm, another kind of attention ruled. The compass mattered greatly. The needle gave north, and from that, the course west could be held. But navigation was still part science, part habit, part guess. Columbus and his pilots estimated speed by watching the water slide past the hull, by judging the pull of the ship, by experience gathered from years at sea. They counted distance by dead reckoning. Course, speed, time. The glass gives time. The compass gives direction. The body and eye guess speed. From these, a line is imagined across emptiness. That line is fragile. It exists in a mind, in a journal, perhaps on a chart. The sea itself does not show it. At noon, if the weather allowed, instruments might appear. A quadrant or astrolabe could help estimate latitude from the height of the sun, though on a small rolling deck the work was difficult. The navigator raises the instrument. The ship moves under him. Sunlight burns his eyes. A wave lifts the deck and lowers it again. A number is taken, perhaps useful, perhaps not. Some of Columbus' recorded attempts were far from accurate by later standards. But the act mattered. In the middle of endless water, any measurement felt like an anchor dropped into uncertainty. Then came food. Food on the crossing was not comfort as we know it. It was maintenance. The ships carried hard biscuit, salted meat, dried cod, chickpeas, lentils, beans, rice in small amounts, olive oil, vinegar, cheese, almonds, raisin, honey if one was lucky, wine, and water. At the beginning, provisions had the reassurance of abundance. Barrels and sacks make a man feel prepared. Days at sea teach him that every store is already disappearing. Cooking happened only when weather allowed. There was no cozy kitchen below. A sand-filled firebox on deck held the flame, carefully controlled because the one thing worse than hunger on a wooden ship is fire. When seas were kind, someone coaxed coals to life and set a pot to boil. Salt meat had to be soaked and boiled to draw out the brine. Lentils or chickpeas softened slowly. Dried fish gave itself back to water in pieces. Oil and vinegar helped. Garlic, if any, remained, made the whole thing briefly smell like food rather than endurance. Men ate in small groups. Wooden bowls, shared portions, bread broken into stew. The ship rolled, and the stew moved with it. Someone held his bowl close. Someone spilled a little and received a complaint too tired to become a quarrel. A man might laugh, because laughter is often the cheapest ration aboard. On rough days, there was no fire. Then the meal became hard biscuit, cheese, dried fish, perhaps wine. The biscuit had been baked until nearly all moisture left it, which made it last and made it stubborn. A man could strike it against the rail, break it with a knife handle, soak it in wine or water, or crumble it into whatever liquid he had. Early in the voyage it was merely hard. Later, it might carry weevils, little lives waking inside the stored flour. Sailors learned methods. Break the biscuit. Tap it. Soak it. Skim what floats. Eat in dim light if courage fails. A philosopher might call it extra protein. A hungry sailor might call the philosopher many things and eat anyway. Water changed too. Fresh from shore, it promised relief. In casks under heat, it grew stale, sour, sometimes green. Wine held better, even when it turned sharp. Wine was not luxury. It was liquid safety, calories, warmth, and a small kindness at the end of a watch. A rough cup of it could make a man feel, for a moment, that the world still contained something besides salt. The body adapted because it had to. Clothes stayed damp. Wool and linen, skin cracked. Lips split. Hair tangled. Hands hardened around rope. Tar got under fingernails and stayed there. Sleep came in fragments. On deck, against coils, under a cloak, near cargo, wherever a body could fold itself without being stepped on too often. There were no hammocks yet for these men. That comfort would come into European use after contact with the Caribbean. On this crossing, Ordinary sailors lay on planks. The ship rocked them, but not gently enough to be trusted. In calm weather, the motion might become a rough cradle. In wet weather, sleep broke into little pieces. A gust, a shout, a shift in sail, a wave striking the hull. The body woke before the mind did. Privacy did not exist. A man changed where he could, relieved himself where the ship allowed, often at the bow over the side, trusting balance and God, prayed near others, dreamed near others, muttered in sleep near others. On a vessel barely larger than a modern room in the imagination, every life rubbed against every other life. Sound was constant. Wind in wrecking, canvas sighing or snapping, blocks knocking, water sliding and slapping along the hull, timbers creaking as if the ship were speaking through tired bones, bells or calls marking the watch, the boy with the glass, the helmsman murmuring course, men singing under breath, men coughing, men laughing, men arguing quietly because no one had room for a full anger unless he wanted everyone to hear it. At night, the sounds changed but did not stop. Voices lowered. The sea seemed louder. The stars came out with a force modern skies rarely show. The Milky Way spread like pale smoke overhead. Polaris held steady to the north. The ships moved west under that immense ceiling, tiny, damp, stubborn, alive. For some men, the stars were navigation. For others, they were company. For others, they were simply proof that the world above still had order, even when the water below seemed endless. This was how the voyage became livable. Not easy, not safe, livable. By repetition, by tasks, by shared food, by the glass turning, by prayers at dawn and evening, by the body learning the deck, by the ear learning which creak was normal and which one required a carpenter, by the hands doing again today what they had done yesterday, while the horizon stayed empty. Days passed this way. The men stopped being shocked by the sea and began being worn by it. Fear did not vanish. It settled into the boards with everything else. It became part of the smell, part of the watch, part of the silence after a joke. The ocean gave them no answer yet. Only wind, water, lavore, and the same round horizon. And while the body learned routine, the mind began searching for signs. Faith did not begin for these men when the land disappeared. It had been with them long before the ships left Palos. It had rung from church bells in the morning. It had moved through narrow streets on feast days with candles and banners and the smell of wax. It had been spoken over infants, over marriages, over fields, over graves. It was not something packed into a chest beside a shirt and a knife. It was the air in which most of them had learned to breathe. At Sia, that air became thinner, and so they held it more carefully. Each day had its prayers. At Damn, while the sky was still gray and the stars were fading slowly behind the masts. Men gathered as much as the deck allowed. Some stood. Some leaned against coils of rope. Some crossed themselves with hands still stiff from the night watch. The Latin words came softly at first, then steadier, carried by voices that knew the sound even when the mind was tired. Pater Noster, Ave Maria. Familiar words, old words, words that had belonged to streets and churches and mothers, now placed carefully over open water. The ship moved beneath them as they prayed. That must have changed the feeling of devotion. On land, a church floor is still. A stone wall holds sound. A candle burns upward. At sea, the deck lifts and falls. The wind pulls at sleeves. A gull may cry, or the rigging may complain, or a wave may strike the hull while a man is asking heaven for mercy. Prayer becomes less like a ceremony and more like a handhold. At evening, when the sun lowered and the sea darkened from blue into iron and then into black, another prayer often came. The Salve Regina. Hail, Holy Queen. A hymn to Mary, Mother of Mercy. Life, sweetness, hope. The words speak of exile, of mourning, of tears, of human beings looking for kindness from a place of difficulty. For sailors who had watched the last island vanish, exile was not an idea from a book. It had a taste. Salt, wine gone sharp, biscuit dust, fear kept behind the teeth. Picture them gathered on the deck of the Santa Maria, or in smaller groups aboard the Nina and the Pinta. The last light lies flat on the water. The sails hang above them, darkening slowly. A boy begins the hymn, perhaps because his voice is clear, perhaps because someone tells him to. The first notes are thin in the wind. Then other voices join. Rough voices, tired voices, a few surprisingly gentle voices from men who might not speak gently at any other hour. For a little while, the fleet becomes one body breathing. The hymn does not remove fear. It gives fear a shape. It turns the private ache in each chest into a shared sound that rises, travels across the deck, and disappears into evening. Honestly, I have always found that image more moving than any painted scene of conquest. Not flags, not armor, not grand gestures, just men in damp clothes singing to the Mother of Mercy while the Atlantic rolls under 3 small ships. Columbus carried faith too, but his faith had a particular heat. He did not seem to think of the voyage as only a commercial gamble. In his later writings, he would place himself inside a great providential design. He believed God had opened a path. He believed lands and peoples were to be brought under Christian rule. He believed wealth from new territories might help fund future sacred ambitions, including old dreams tied to Jerusalem. We cannot know exactly how fully he spoke these ideas during the first crossing, but the shape of his mind seems clear enough. The voyage was not merely westward in his imagination. It was part of a divine pattern. That kind of conviction can steady people. It can also trouble them. A sailor may be comforted by an admiral who believes heaven has chosen the route. A sailor may also wonder why heaven has chosen such a wet and uncomfortable way to make its point. Sailors are practical theologians when the biscuit is crawling and the water smells wrong. Still, Columbus needed that faith. So did the crew. The open sea had too much space for doubt. We should be careful with an old myth about this voyage. The men were not all sailing in terror because they believed the world was flat and that the ships might fall from the edge. Educated Europeans and experienced pilots knew the earth was round. That knowledge was not new. The real fear was different, and in some ways more reasonable. They did not know the width of the ocean. They did not know if winds would let them return. They did not know if the food would last. They did not know if the sea would hold them in a calm until water turned foul and men began to look at one another differently. A round world can still be too large, and knowledge does not erase imagination. In taverns, on docks, in stories told by older sailors to younger ones, the Western Ocean Sea had gathered shadows. Some called it a sea of darkness, not because no sunlight touched it, but because no trusted route crossed it in the minds of these men. Unknown water invites creatures. Medieval maps sometimes filled distant seas with monstrous fish, serpents, strange islands, and warning shapes. Cartographers were not always saying, "I saw this." Sometimes they were saying, "Beyond here, the world is not settled." A young sailor on night watch could know in his better mind that sea monsters were tavern talk, and still look harder at a dark swell when it rose beside the ship. A fin in moonlight becomes a story. A floating log becomes a back. A splash becomes a warning. Fear is a very talented artist. It finishes every sketch. There were also calms to fear. A storm is frightening because it moves too much. A calm is frightening because it does not move at all. Sailors knew that a ship without wind is only a box waiting on water. If the sails hang empty and the sea turns glassy, time becomes heavy. Food shrinks. Water worsens. Tempers thicken. Men listen for wind the way sick people listen for footsteps outside a door. Then the sea itself changed. Around the middle of September, the fleet entered waters filled with drifting weed. Today we know it as sargasso weed, brown, branching, floating in great loose mats, home to tiny creatures and little hidden lives. To men who had never crossed that region before, it must have seemed both promising and wrong. At first, weed meant land might be near. Plants grow from somewhere. Perhaps a coast lay beyond the next low curve of water. Men leaned over the side. Hooks reached down. Wet tangles came up, shining in the light, smelling green and faintly rotten. They may have laughed at first. "There is the shore," someone might have said. "We only have to walk across it." Sailors will joke at the edge of dread. It is cheaper than courage and often works nearly as well. But the weed continued. Day after day, patches drifted around the ships, sometimes thin, sometimes thick enough to make the sea look like a meadow drowned in salt. The wind grew lighter in places. The sails did not always fill with the clean strength the men wanted. The ships moved, but slowly enough that worry could climb aboard. What if the weed held them? What if the hulls became trapped? What if hidden shoals waited underneath? What if this was not a sign of land, but a place where ships went to stop? Columbus reassured them. This was simply another region of the sea. The compass still worked. The swell still moved. The ships were not trapped by plants. But reassurance is a fragile thing when the same brown weed slides past all day and the horizon refuses to change. Signs began to matter more. Birds drew attention. A single bird crossing the mast could pull half the deck into silence. Which way did it fly? Was it a seabird that could range far, or one that returned to land at evening? A flock mattered more. A flock moving steadily in one direction became almost an argument. Men watched wings until their eyes ached. Columbus and the pilots noted such things carefully, and ordinary sailors did too. Coastal people know birds. They know that life has habits. Out there, any habit might point toward shore. The color of the water mattered. Greenish water could mean shallower depths, or simply a trick of light and weed. Deep blue meant great depth, or at least that is how it felt in the body. Clouds mattered. A cloud bank fixed on the horizon could be land, or could become land in the mind before evening dissolved it. Floating branches mattered. Grass mattered. Anything with freshness in it mattered. A piece of wood shaped by human hands would have mattered most of all, but that would come later. For now, the men lived between prayer and omen. These were not separate worlds to them. A sailor could sing to Mary at dusk, mutter about monsters at midnight, cross himself at a shooting star, and still trim a sail with perfect, practical skill at dawn. That is not contradiction. That is being human in an age when the unknown was wide and the ship was small. Saints traveled with them in names and vows. Saint Elmo, Saint Nicholas, the Virgin Mary. Each could be called when wind rose too sharply or dropped too long. Men promised candles, pilgrimages, offerings, barefoot walks to shrines, if only they reached land. A vow at sea is a small bargain made with eternity while gripping a wet rail. It may sound grand later. In the moment, it is breath, salt, and fear. Columbus himself used providence as a compass of the mind. He spoke, or at least thought, in terms of divine purpose. He saw signs as part of a larger design. To him, the westward road was not empty. It was being opened. For the crew, that belief may have helped and irritated in equal measure. A man hauling rope in a wet squall might be grateful that the admiral is certain. He might also quietly wish Providence had arranged a larger ship. The days kept passing. Morning prayers, work, watches, noon sight, if possible, food, repairs, signs, evening hymn, sleep broken by motion. Half-hour glass turned again. The same men in the same cramped spaces, the same ropes in the same hands, the same horizon, sometimes glittering, sometimes dull, sometimes almost cruel in its calmness. Under repetition, thought changes. At first, the unknown is exciting because it is ahead. Then it becomes tiring because it remains ahead. Then it becomes frightening because it still remains ahead. The mind begins to ask the same questions in smaller and smaller circles. How far have we come? How far remains? Does Columbus know? Do the Pinzons know? Does anyone know? This is where faith and fear begin to rub against each other. Prayer gives shape to dread, but dread does not vanish. Signs offer hope, but hope fades if land does not follow. A bird can lift a crew for an hour. By night, if no shore appears, the same bird becomes another false promise. And still, the ships moved west. The wind filled the canvas. The hulls worked softly through the swell. The weed drifted away and returned. The stars came out one by one, then in thousands. Men lay on hard planks and listened to the ship speak around them. Some slept. Some counted days. Some whispered prayers. Some watched the dark water and imagined the monsters that maps had drawn for places no one understood. The ocean sea did not need monsters, though. It had distance. It had silence. It had the power to make men doubt the size of their own courage. By the last days of September, the prayers were still being said, but the words now floated over a different mood. The crew had not turned back. Land had not appeared. The signs had not become a shore. The glass kept turning, and with every turn, another small measure of home slipped behind them. Soon the voyage would become a question of numbers. Not heavenly numbers. Not sacred numbers. Hard, practical numbers. Leagues sailed. Leagues admitted. Leagues hidden. The ocean would begin to shrink on one page and grow on another. And in that quiet difference, the fear of the men would find a new place to gather. By the last days of September, the ocean had become a circle with no door. The men had been at sea long enough for memory to change. Spain no longer felt like a place just behind the shoulder. The Canary Islands were gone from sight, and then gone from the body. No longer a shape that could be imagined clearly. Home became smaller in the mind, not because it mattered less, but because distance wears down detail. A face remains. A room remains. A smell of bread. A street corner. A church bell. But the whole town begins to blur, like a shoreline seen through mist. The horizon did not blur. It stayed clean and merciless. Every morning, water. Every noon, water. Every evening, water darkening under the same enormous sky. Men who had spent their lives at sea were used to hardship, but many were used to coasts, routes, ports, eastlands, landmarks. This was different. This was sailing inside a moving emptiness. Under that kind of sameness, men count. They counted days first. Then they counted what they thought they had sailed. A sailor may not write numbers in a journal, but his body keeps records. He knows what a good wind feels like. He knows how fast a vessel seems to move when the wake runs strongly and the sails are full. He knows when the sea has carried him far. Even without formal calculation, the men must have felt the distance growing behind them. Columbus felt it too. According to later summaries of the lost journal, he began to keep two reckonings of distance. One for himself, closer to what he believed the ships had actually made. Another smaller number, spoken or shown to the crew, so they would not be frightened by how far they had gone. On the 9th day of September, The account suggests he made a greater distance than he admitted. Later, the pattern continued. The private ocean was larger. The public ocean was made a little smaller. Imagine him at his writing place, the ship moving under him, the page or chart held steady with one hand. The candle or lamp is poor. The air smells of oil, salt, and damp wood. He listens to the creak of the stern. He hears men above or beyond the partition. He knows they are counting in their own way. He writes a number, then another. The quill moves quietly, but the quiet is not innocent. Was this a lie? Was it leadership? Was it fear management? Historians debate the tone of it. We should not picture the crew as foolish children who could be tricked easily by a few smaller numbers. The Nina and the Pinta had experienced pilots. The Pinzon brothers knew the sea. Ordinary sailors could feel when a ship was running well. You cannot tell a man he has crawled all day when the wind has been pulling like a team of mules. So the double reckoning may have been less a perfect deception than a way of managing mood. A public number for anxious ears. A private number for navigation. A little shrinking of the ocean in conversation, even as the real ocean grew behind them. It is a very human act. Not noble exactly. Not foolish exactly. A man leading other men into uncertainty sometimes discovers that truth itself has weight, and he fears dropping too much of it at once. The crew did not need exact numbers to feel the problem. They had sailed west for days, then more days, then more. Where was Cipango, the island they expected near Asia? Where were the signs of the Great Khan? Where were the spice lands? The ports, the people, the coast that books and calculations had promised would be somewhere across the sea. Whispers began to thicken. Not always open rebellion. The dramatic stories of mutiny have grown in retelling, and the surviving evidence is more careful than legend. But discontent was real enough. Men talked near the windlass, by the rail, under the shadow of sails. A voice would say they had gone far enough. Another would say the wind that carried them west might never carry them home. Someone would mutter that Columbus was a foreigner and too certain for a man who had not yet found anything. Someone else might glance around before answering, because fear can make even a whisper feel dangerous. A ship is too small for secrets, but it is perfect for murmurs. Columbus could not ignore this. He needed obedience, but he also needed the men not to break inside. The authority of Ferdinand and Isabella was far away. A royal document cannot quiet a deck full of frightened sailors in the dark. What mattered was food, wind, distance, trust, and the support of men the crew respected. That meant Martin Alonso Pinzon. The sailors of Palos and the nearby towns knew him. He was not a distant visionary. He was one of their own world, a mariner with reputation, shill, and local weight. If Columbus was the flame of the voyage, Pinzon was the iron that kept it in shape. The men could look toward the Pinta and know that someone they trusted was still continuing. That mattered more than any speech. There were moments when the course itself became a matter of interpretation. Birds appeared. Some flew southwest. Some seemed to be moving with purpose. Pinzon and others took them seriously. A bird at sea is not only a bird. It is a line drawn by life. It goes from somewhere to somewhere. If you can read it, perhaps you can find the shore. Columbus wanted to keep west, because his theory needed west. But the signs began pulling the mind in a slightly different direction. Birds, floating plants, changes in water, all suggested land might lie not straight ahead, but somewhat to the southwest. Eventually, the fleet adjusted, following hope as much as calculation. This did not mean Columbus surrendered his plan. It meant the ocean had begun speaking in signs no one could ignore. The men watched everything now. A carved or worked piece of wood would pass from hand to hand like a relic. A branch with berries. A reed. Fresh green growth that smelled faintly of earth. These things came out of the water, carrying more power than gold for men who had seen nothing but sea. A berry meant land had roots somewhere. A branch meant trees. A worked object meant human hands. The difference between despair and hope could be a wet stick lifted from the Atlantic. Picture that moment. A sailor leans over the rail with a hook. The sea is dark blue, moving under the hull. Something floats close. Not weed, not foam. He catches it, draws it up, and water streams from it onto the deck. Men gather. It is wood, shaped somehow, or a branch that has not been long in the sea. The smell is faint, but there. Green. Earth. Not tar. Not salt. Not rot from a barrel. Earth. No perfume in the world could have seemed sweeter. The mood did not become easy. It sharpened. Hope can be as painful as fear when it has been delayed. Every sign raised the heart, then made waiting harder. Birds at evening. No land by dark. A branch by morning. No shore by noon. Green water, then blue again. A cloud that looked like land, then changed shape and betrayed itself. The men were not only afraid of dying now, they were afraid of being fooled by hope. Columbus had to hold the fleet together through this tightening. He offered promises. He gave explanations. He interpreted signs. He watched the men watching him. Some later accounts suggest the crew pressed him to turn back, and that he negotiated for a few more days. The exact details are debated, and old stories may have made the scene more theatrical than it was. But the emotional truth is easy to feel. At some point, every man aboard must have asked, if land does not come soon, how long do we keep going? That question changes the sound of a ship. The same rope creaks differently when a man thinks it may have to pull him home. The same wind feels less like help and more like a trap if it blows only west. The same night watch becomes heavier when every star seems to ask how far you have gone. Yet the signs kept coming. Birds. Wheat. Reeds. Brunch. Berries. Worked wood. The fleet was approaching land, though the men did not yet know how close. The ocean had begun sending fragments ahead of the shore, as if the unseen world were shedding small pieces of itself into their path. By the 11th day of October, the atmosphere aboard the ships had changed completely. The long despair had not vanished. but it had become tense expectation. Men climbed higher to look. Lookouts strained into the glare. Every patch of cloud was judged. Every shadow on the horizon was questioned. Talk fell into short bursts. A man could feel others holding their breath without anyone saying so. That evening, Columbus ordered special vigilance. Land was close. Rewards had been promised for the first sighting, and now the promise mattered with a new sharpness. It was not only gold or favor. It was the right to be the first voice that pulled land out of darkness. The day lowered slowly. The sea darkened. The ships moved under a sky clearing toward night. The prayers came again. But now the Salve Regina must have sounded different. Not only pleading, almost expectant. Men who had sung the hymn over empty water now sang it with branches and birds in memory. The words rose from tired mouths into the dusk. Mother of mercy, life, sweetness, hope. Hope was no longer abstract. It was somewhere ahead, hidden in the dark. After the hymn, men stayed awake longer than usual. Even those off watch may have slept lightly, if at all. The deck held a silence crowded with listening. The ships moved west and a little south, toward the signs. Water whispered along the hull. The rigging hummed. A lantern glowed low and shielded. Above, the stars burned with the cold brightness of open sea. Around 10 in the evening, Columbus later reported seeing a small light in the distance. A flicker. Something rising and falling, as if carried by a hand or hidden by motion. Others may have seen it too, though not all accounts agree in a way that settles the matter. It has been debated ever since. Was it a torch on land? A fire? A trick of the eye? A star near the horizon? A light from another vessel was impossible in the ordinary sense. Yet the mind of that night was ready to turn any spark into meaning. The little light did not end the waiting. The ships continued through darkness. Lookouts watched until their eyes hurt. The sea remained black. The horizon was almost nothing. A line guessed more than seen. On the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana kept watch. He was an ordinary sailor, not the admiral, not the author of the voyage, not the man whose name would dominate the story. Just a man looking into the night from a small ship that had sailed too far to make fear useful anymore. Then, around 2 in the morning, he saw it. Not a cloud, not a wave. A dark line that held its place. A shape where no shape had been before. Land. The cry went out across the water. Land. Land. The Pinta fired a signal gun, and the sound rolled over the Black Sea to the other ships. Men woke. Men stumbled. Men prayed. Some laughed. Some may have wept. After weeks of water, the word land must have struck them like a bell inside the bones. They were not dead. Not yet. The world had answered. But the shore ahead was not Asia as they imagined it. It was another world entirely, living, inhabited, ancient in its own ways, and unaware that these 3 small ships would change everything. For the sailors, the dark line meant survival. For the people waiting beyond that dawn, it was the first shadow of a storm still gathering beyond the edge of sight. The cry crossed the black water before any man fully understood it. Land. Land. On the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana had seen a dark line where the empty horizon had been. He was not a king, not an admiral, not the face that would later fill paintings and schoolbooks. He was a tired sailor on watch, standing on damp planks, eyes sore from weeks of salt, wind, and darkness. For so long there had been only water and sky. Then, suddenly, something held still ahead. The signal gun fired. Its sound rolled across the sea and reached the Santa Maria and the Nina. Men woke from rough sleep. Cloaks fell from shoulders. Bare feet searched for balance on wet boards. Someone crossed himself before he was fully awake. Someone laughed once, too sharply. Someone whispered a prayer and could not finish it. After weeks of hard biscuit, stalevater, sour wine, rope burns, hidden distances, and the fear that the ocean had no mercy, the word land must have felt almost unreal. Land meant water that did not taste of a cask. Land meant trees, shad, fruit, sand under the foot, sleep without the ship lifting beneath the ribs. Land meant the west was not endless, but the shore was still dark. The ships could not rush in. Unknown coastlines are gentle only in daylight. Reefs can wait just below the surface, like pale bones. Shoals can tear open a hull before a crew has time to thank God for survival. So they held back, moving carefully, listening to the night change around them. Imagine that waiting. The men know land is near, but they cannot yet touch it. The sea sounds different now, or seems to. Perhaps there is a low breath of surf. Perhaps the air carries a faint green smell, something beyond tar, bilge, smoke, and salted meat. A smell of leaves. A smell of earth. After weeks of ocean, even the idea of earth has a fragrance. Columbus later said he had seen a small light before the cry of land. A faint, moving flame in the distance. We cannot be sure what it was. A torch on shore. Perhaps. A fire. A star near the horizon. A trick of longing in tired eyes. That little light has remained uncertain, and maybe that is fitting. The whole voyage had been carried by uncertain light. Then dawn began. Gray entered the sky slowly. The black line ahead softened. Shapes gathered out of darkness. Low land. Trees. A pale shore. Water brightening from deep blue to green, then to clear shining shallows near the beach. The men had lived for weeks inside a world of wood, canvas, rope, salt, and empty horizon. Now color returned all at once. Green must have seemed like mercy. The island was not Asia as Columbus imagined it, though he believed he had reached islands near the eastern world described in books and maps. It was the Caribbean, alive in its own right, old in its own ways, known already to the people who lived there. That is the truth we must hold softly. The land was not empty. It had names, paths, gardens, families, canoes, songs, hunger, memory, and fear before the ships appeared. The Taino people watched the vessels from shore. Try to see the morning from their side for a moment. 3 wooden things with pale wings stand on the water. Strange men move upon them. Cloth hangs from their bodies. Hair grows on their faces. Metal catches the sun. Crosses and flags are lifted. Voices carry across the shallows in sounds no one on shore can understand. Curiosity would have been natural. Fear, too. Perhaps silence? Perhaps laughter. Human beings do not stop being human at the edge of history. From the ships, the sailors watched back. They saw people, canoes, ornaments, brown bodies near the beach, faces turned toward the floating strangers. Luis de Torres, the interpreter chosen for Arabic, Hebrew, and other languages Columbus expected to need in Asia, had no key for this shore. The wrong world had been imagined. The real one had arrived. Columbus went ashore with ceremony. Banners were carried. Royal names were spoken. The island was claimed for Ferdinand and Isabella. To the exhausted sailors, the ritual may have felt like the rightful ending of suffering. They had survived the unknown sea. Their admiral took possession. The voyage had meaning. And yet, beneath that ceremony, a darker question waited. How can a man claim a land already lived in? How can a shore become new because strangers have stepped upon it? The men of 1492 did not carry that question as we do now, but history carried it for them. The first exchanges were gentle on the surface. Glass beads, small bells, red caps, cotton thread, parrots, ornaments, gestures, smiles, hands extended, eyes studying eyes. Misunderstanding moved between both sides like another tide. The Europeans looked for gold and signs of kingdoms. The Taino looked at the strangers and learned them as people learn anything unknown, by watching appetite, movement, tone, and touch. For an ordinary sailor, the first step onto sand may have mattered more than politics. After weeks on planks, the ground did not rise. A man might press his toes down and feel the world hold still. He might drink fresh water and feel it pass through him like mercy. He might smell leaves and smoke, hear birds in trees, and think only that he was alive. That relief was real. So was the shadow behind it. The ships had brought frightened men to shore, but they had also brought claims, hunger, monarchy, and the first thin edge of empire. Columbus admired what he saw, but he also measured it. He praised the people, and he wondered how easily they might be ruled. He noticed beauty, generosity, and innocence in his own terms, and beside those words came thoughts of conversion, lavor, and gold. That mixture is the quiet tragedy of the first dawn. Wonder and possession arrived together. Night near the island must have felt strange after the open sea. The ships rested at anchor. The waves softened. Insects called from land. Leaves moved in warm air. The stars were still the same stars, but now they hung over trees instead of endless water. For the sailors, it must have felt like being given back to the world. They had crossed. They had not died. The dark line had become land. But for the people watching from shore, the same morning was not an ending. It was the beginning of something no one there had asked for, and no one could yet stop. After the first landfall, the islands seemed to open one behind another. Columbus still believed he had reached the outer edges of Asia. His mind searched for the world promised by books, rich courts, great rulers, spices, gold, and the road to the great Khan. But the shores before him did not answer in that language. They answered with clear water, canoes, gardens, cotton, barats, village, smoke rising through trees, and people whose words none of the Europeans could understand. Luis de Torres had been brought to speak with the East. He knew Arabic, Hebrew, some Aramaic, and Castilian. Those were useful keys for doors Columbus expected to find. But on Cuba, when he was sent inland, he found no palace, no court, no merchant city of Asia. He found villages. He saw people using dried leaves and smoke in a way Europeans had not recorded before. Tobacco entered European notice through a misunderstanding, almost quietly, like a small ember carried out of one world into another. Gold became the word that pulled Columbus onward. A little ornament, a gesture toward another island, a sign made by hands, a half-understood answer. Each small thing fed the hope that greater wealth lay just beyond the next shore. For the sailors, gold meant reward. It meant proof. It meant that hunger, fear, vet sleep, and the long Atlantic would come home as something a man could hold. Then came Hispaniola. The island seemed full of promise. Mountains, rivers, village, hints of gold. Columbus formed a relationship with Guacanagari, a local leader, though both sides likely understood that relationship differently. Gifts moved back and forth. Smiles did some work. Gestures did more. Misunderstanding filled the spaces between. On Christmas Eve, the sea turned gentle enough to be dangerous. The Santa Maria was near the coast. Columbus had gone to rest. According to later accounts, the helm was left to a shipboy when it should not have been. We cannot know every breath of blame across that night, but we know what happened. The flagship drifted onto a reef. At first, perhaps, there was only a scrape beneath the hull. Then a shudder. Wood touching coral. Men waking. Voices rising. Feet striking deck. The Atlantic had carried the ship across the unknown sea. But now, in calm water near land, she was held and ruined by the reef. The Santa Maria was lost. Not in a grand plunge into deep water. More slowly, more sadly, a ship can die by breaking apart under a quiet sky. Cargo had to be saved. Barrels, tools, planks, provision, and gear were moved to safety. The Taino people under Guacanagari helped the Europeans salvage what they could. That detail matters. In that moment, the people later threatened by this arrival were rescuers. The broken timber of the Santa Maria became a small fort Columbus named it La Navidad because the wreck came at Christmas. Wood that had crossed the Atlantic became walls on Caribbean soil. A ship became a settlement. A rescue became an outpost. 39 men were left there. Pause with them. For some, it may have felt like opportunity. First settlers, men of fortune, holders of a new place. For others, it may have felt like abandonment dressed in brave words. They had no ship of their own. They did not know the language. They depended on fragile goodwill. They watched the Nina and the Pinta prepare to leave, and perhaps some tried to believe that Columbus would return quickly. The ships sailed. The return voyage began in January of 1493. The Santa Maria was gone, and the remaining vessels carried men, stories, pirates, cotton, gold ornaments, and indigenous captives taken across the sea. That too belongs to the truth. The voyage carried wonder home, but also people removed from their own world. The route east was harsh. Columbus could not simply turn around and ride the same wind back. He sailed north to find winds that would carry him toward Europe. The open Atlantic returned, colder and rougher. Storms rose. Waves struck the little ships. Wind tore at sails. Men hauled lines with numb hands and salt on their lips. In one desperate storm, Columbus reportedly wrote an account of what he had found, sealed it, and cast it into the sea in a cask, hoping that if the ships vanished, the news might survive. We cannot be fully certain of every detail, but the image feels true to the danger. A message in a cask, thrown into gray water, because even triumph can drown. The men prayed. They made vows. They promised offerings if they lived. Prayer in a storm is not elegant. It is breath. It is a hand on a rail. It is a wet face turned toward heaven, because skill has reached its edge. At last, land returned on the eastern side of the ocean. The Azores. Then Lisbon. Then Palos in March of 1493. Imagine the harbor again. The smells of mud, tar, fish, and smoke. Families gathering near the water. Men stepping ashore, thinner, harder, changed. Some faces were found. Some were not. The ships that came back were familiar and strange at once. Martin Alonso Pinzon returned ill and died soon after. He had been essential to the voyage, the local strength behind Columbus. But history often gives its brightest lamps to fewer names than deserve them. Columbus went to court. News spread. More ships would follow. More men. More priests. More officials. More hunger for gold. The first voyage became triumph in Spain, but across the ocean, its shadow lengthened. When Columbus later returned to Hispaniola, La Navidad had been destroyed, and the 39 men left there were dead. The causes were tangled in greed, fear, conflict, and broken relations. The little fort had not become a peaceful seed. It had become a warning. So we hold two truths together. The sailors were brave. Their fear was real. Their hunger was real. Their skill kept fragile ships alive across a vast ocean. But the crossing also opened the way to conquest, forced labor, disease, seizure, and grief for the peoples of the Americas. The first meeting held gifts and wonder, but also claims made without consent. The image that remains is small. A shipboy turns the glass. A sailor sees land in the dark. Columbus steps onto sand with flags. The Santa Maria breaks on a reef. A cask disappears into storm water. A harbor in Palos receives men who are not the same men who left. Let the ships rest now. Let the half-hour glass stop for a while. Let the ropes dry. Let the tar cool. Let the ocean breathe without carrying anyone west. 3 small ships crossed the dark water, and the world was joined to itself by a seam that could never be unpicked. Good night.